All right, well, the panel we have here prepared some questions in the areas of the job search, maybe what do employers look for, since all of us have been in that or are in that position. And then we had a couple questions on your career forward, what happens when you get the job, and work-life balance and things like that. And then I have a couple questions on executive leadership, as some of us have, Naren was a CEO, and so if you have any other questions along the way, we're really looking for those questions just to be teasers, just to start the conversation, ask questions anytime, take us down a different path. We're here for you. To help you with your questions and what you might be interested in. So that's the format, and to start us off before we do the questions, Naren's going to talk a little bit about SEE and the job market, and just a few words about the board that we're on.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Sherry. As Vital mentioned, other than being Penn Staters, the other thing we have in common is we're all members of the Service Engineering, Enterprise Engineering Advisory Board. And this was a board that was actually started back in 2003. So we're almost 14 years old now. And Chuck and one of Janice's predecessors, saw that where the U.S. economy was going and the job opportunities, and how over time the service industry was dwarfing the manufacturing industry. And he wanted to make sure that we drove that awareness across the engineering community. A lot of people in engineering view that as a threat. We actually saw it as an opportunity. Because many of the tools and techniques that you've learned is your traditional engineering curriculum, whether it's applied to manufacturing or not, apply significantly within the service industry as well. And so we've been working together as a group for well over a decade now, helping the department heads and the faculty identify case studies that could be used in the classroom, capstone projects. I know maybe many of you were involved in the capstone projects that were executed this week and had the contest there, and just driving the overall awareness in the curriculum so that when students come out of Penn State, they are prepared for opportunities within the service sector. And before we jump into the questions, I thought I'd just kind of help frame this for you. One is, first, let's get a common agreement of what the service sector is. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics isn't great. It's basically saying any business that does not make a tangible product, by definition, is a service business. Now that's a pretty broad area, but you can see on the chart behind us, there's a lot of different industries: the transportation industry, retail industry, logistics, hospitals, healthcare more broadly, the security industry that I worked in. There's a product piece, but also a service piece. So it really is a very broad and diverse set of industries. And I think the most important aspect of that is when you think about where employment is these days. What percentage of U.S. employment do you think is tied to the service industry versus manufacturing industry? Anybody venture to guess?
70-30 maybe.
How much?
17 service, 13 manufacturing.
70-30 service versus manufacturing. Does that sound about right? Let me share with you kind of how it's changed over the past 50 years. If you look back on the left-hand side of this chart, in 1960, 12 of the top 15 employers in the country were manufacturing companies. It was the big automotive companies, so the Fords, the General Motors, the Chryslers. It was the steel companies. U.S. Steel is on there, Bethlehem Steel is on there. The multi-industry conglomerates, places like I worked at GE and Westinghouse were on there. So 12 of the top 15 employers in the U.S. were manufacturing. Fast forward 50 years to 2010, and that had flipped. 12 of the top 15 were service companies. Big retailers like Jim works with on a regular basis. Walmart, I think, is up there. 2.1 million employees. I mean, it's just staggering how large these service businesses. And that was in 2010. That was before the explosion of, quote, the new age economy. Think about companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon and Uber, the number of employees that they have. In 2010, the number was 86%. 86% of the employment in the U.S. was service, with 14% being in the manufacturing side. And you know, a lot of people talk about this in the context, well, that's a U.S. issue because we're a very mature economy. And this is a chart that was put out by the World Bank years ago. It really is the natural evolution. Most economies start out as agriculture economies, and then they go through some type of industrial revolution where manufacturing takes the lead, and then as they mature, manufacturing finds its way to lower factor cost countries, and it's the service economy that takes over. So whether you're planning to build your career in the U.S. or any place in the world, it's likely that over your career you will see this shift. Even if you don't start out with that mix today, over time every economy kind of matures and moves in that direction. So it really is where a lot of the jobs are. And I guess the good news is the tools and skills and capabilities and experiences that you're learning as an industrial and manufacturing engineering student at Penn State, all of those apply in the service sector. They can be deployed there, and there are ripe opportunities to drive significant productivity improvements as well as innovation by using those tools. So you guys can have a huge impact in those areas that probably have not been aggressively recruiting engineers over the year and are just starting to understand the value that engineers can add to those organizations. I thought that might be a useful kind of context and backdrop for you. I won't bother to go with this one. Sherry, you want to start with questions maybe?
All right, well, let's start with the job search and trying to tap into that 87% of the market. How many in the audience are actively involved in a job search right now? Good number of you, some, yep, thinking about it at least. So let's talk first about what, as employers, what do we look for in the employers, in both the resume we might receive, but then the interview, which is probably as important. What exactly are we looking for beyond the GPA or the quite obvious things?
Yep.
Jim, you want to start?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Jim Wilk. Very happy to be here. Excited to talk about this. In my team, we're fortunate enough that we do recruit Penn State students to work with us on our co-op program. So we get to interview people, bring them into our program, and then get to work with them, and then it matures into full-time employment. So we kind of get a trial run, and it's really nice to interact with the students when I come up here for the recruiting fairs and things like that. So what we tend to look for, as Sherry said, there's definitely the aptitude and the skills in industrial engineering, but it really comes down to, would you be comfortable, number one, working with that person or putting them in front of a customer? Because you have to have those communication skills. It can't all be the intellect and what we're looking for. And especially in the service industry, when you're talking about a retailer and you're working with associates that are selling, and you're working in a store where the public is there, you have to have those types of skills to be able to ask the right questions and just have those social skills that we're looking for, to be nice and well-rounded and be able to handle things that may come up on the fly, different questions and things like that. So, yes, question?
I certainly finished as what you were going to say, but I was wondering
Yep.
if maybe you could give us like a tangible, like this is what someone said that we were like, oh yeah, this isn't going to work, and maybe an example of like, this is what someone said that we were like, oh yeah, they would be good at this job.
Okay. Well, I'll give you an example of actually, working out in the field. Is having the kind of the social presence as to what to say when you're out in a store. Say you're doing observations around utilization, and if usually utilization is anonymous, right? You're doing observations and you're in a store, and people don't. You kind of blend into the woodwork. And if somebody catches you and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" If you kind of freeze and get all nervous as to like, "Well, and can't give the answer," then that could be an issue. So if you just say, "Hey, I'm here, working with this company. We're trying to improve the customer and guest experience, and we're just doing some observations," and usually that puts people at ease. So those types of things, is what we're looking for. So So that, those types of skills.
And I'll chime in. I often look for, I'll say leadership / teamwork. Leadership can be, the president of a society, or it could be something as simple as, leading a club or leading a project. And then I usually ask people, well, how did that leadership go? And, you're working with your teammates, and if I hear the word, well, I did this, but I don't hear the teamwork aspect of how you integrated with the team, or you were socially, had skills to pull the team together and pull things off, then I start to wonder, because in industry, unlike sometimes in academia where you really are judged on just your work, it's almost always teamwork in industry, and how you work with a team can make or break your success with a company.
I'd say the only other things, or two things that I would add that I look for, is passion. I want people who are excited to come to the company that I work for. People who have done some homework on the company, at least showed that they're interested. They're not just showing up because I'm on the interview schedule. So they've done a little bit of homework on the company, they ask good questions, and you can see that energy and passion that this is something they really want to do. And I would say the second area that I probe in an interview is critical thinking. The best question I ever got when I was interviewing, it was after graduate school actually, and guy is still a good friend of mine and a mentor, it was when I went to Booz Allen, and he asked me, how long would it take to haul away Mount Fuji? And it was such a weird question, and I started down the path of, what's the analytical framework that I would use? Okay, well, I know that, I don't know how tall Mount Fuji is, but I know Denver is the mile-high city, so let's start assuming that it's a mile high, worst case. Don't know I know what the volume of a cone is, so I can kind of model it that way. And I kept telling him the pieces, well, here's how I would do it. And he just looked at me and said, that's great, but how long would it take you? He wanted an answer. He wanted to say, could I make the assumptions? Whether my assumptions were right or wrong were irrelevant. But make the assumption, use the data you have or whatever you can infer, and come to an answer. Whether the answer is right or not was irrelevant to him. It was, do you have that critical thinking? Can you construct it? And then can you make some assumptions? Because you're never going to have all the data that you need to make a decision. You're going to have to make some assumptions. Then you'll go back and run the sensitivity of the assumption. Maybe it wasn't a mile high, it was only half a mile high, and you could run those ranges of answers to kind of get a feel for it. But it made me think differently. That they're not looking for people who know the formula for figuring it out. They're looking for people who can solve problems.
A lot of times in an interview, I'll ask a question, okay, you had this very successful project. What was the hardest part and how did you get over it? Or what was the stumbling block? There had to be some. And I'll ask, what was your thought process to get through that and how did you handle it? And I'm not looking for pat answers, in there that it's not an academic question. It's more, like he said, it's what experience have you had and how did you actually actively handle something that was a real world event.
This is the part where you're supposed to jump in and ask questions.
And I would say,
I want to make a clarification. In academia, it isn't all about person. So I don't want them to fix this. We've had an active faculty search this semester for 4 positions, and the qualities that we look for nowadays in faculty is we want to know what distinguishes them, where their strength is, and we can discern passion also. But we also look for, who could this person potentially collaborate with in the department or in another area of the college or the university. And when we look at collaboration, we also look at, would they be someone very interested in working with the students and being a good mentor and a good educator. So I just want to dispel the notion that at a university job that it's all about me. It isn't, actually. Some of the students in here are PhD students who are still exploring. I think all of the students are still exploring what do they want to be when they grow up. I am too.
I am too.
And so they're kind of pondering the different
And I think that's one of the intangibles that you really need to decide when you're looking for that job. What is the company like? What's the culture like? Are they going to permit me to have a work-life balance, or are they going to, make me work a lot round the clock? I'll give you an example. I'm in the aerospace industry. I don't know if anyone's ever thought of working at SpaceX. Great company. But let me tell you, we get a lot of people in my company that come from SpaceX because they really want you to work 50, 60 hours a week every week. And they have food, laundry facilities, childcare, everything on site so that you stay there as the maximum amount of time. And some people thrive in that environment, so I'm not saying it's bad, but you really have to look at what is the environment I'm stepping into. Is that what I want? Or do I want something or a company that gives me a little more balance or freedom, or what is that culture? And those are some of the intangibles that you have to do your homework on. Like Aaron said, you have to look ahead and say, what is this company really like? Ask some of the employees, look ahead.
I think Sherry brings up a great point. You shouldn't be looking at the job that you're interviewing for. I mean, on average, and let Sherry and Jim comment as well. I don't think I ever stayed in a job more than 4 years throughout my career. So, on average, especially early in my career, it was 18 months to 2 years moving into a new job. So if I joined a company for a specific job, not thinking about what my career could look like, I would have been changing companies about every 2 years because I would have outgrown that job or had the opportunity. So really finding the company that will give you the longer term opportunities you want to grow and advance, and the culture that you're comfortable in, that the company's values are aligned with your values, I think is very important.
Yep.
How do you suggest them do that? So, for example, a lot of the companies that I'm interested in working for are not big companies, so I'm not looking at like the NASA's and the Boeings and the SpaceX apps. So how does one go about figuring out what company culture is and how many hours are actually expected?
I would say the most valuable resource you can have is the Penn State alumni. If there are Penn State alums at that school, and there's the alumni directory out there, there's LinkedIn, it's easy to find out. At least my experience is the Penn State alumni are always willing to help their fellow alums. So if you reach out to them and ask them the questions about the culture, or without asking the generic question about the culture, what's your typical week look like? And you can find out from those types of things. And Glassdoor, go out. Again, maybe the real small companies don't have a profile on Glassdoor, but I never liked what they said about me on Glassdoor, but the reality is it's real employees grading the company and grading the CEO, but that's a different story.
And I'd say that's definitely a fair question in the interview, right? So that shows kind of your interest, and do I really want to? I'm really interested in understanding this is right for me too. And so there's that component, and then the travel piece of it. If it's a traveling position, I work in consulting, and really always have, so it's really good, especially early in your career, that if you're interested in that. But if you're not, then I wouldn't do it. But if you get to see a lot of different things, work with a lot of different clients, and get around. But as your life progresses and things change, then maybe that's not as good for you. So either the company can be more accommodating, or you can move into another position within the company. You can do that, and I happen to be able to do that in the companies that I work for. And so I've been able to kind of sustain and stay on that team. So there's definitely accommodations that companies will make for work-life balance. And then the other thing I'd say about just work-life balance was kind of the original thing is just this thing is, thing that can really affect your work-life balance. And it can be a good thing because, and it just depends on the culture of your company. If you feel comfortable and you're comfortable responding to things really fast, you can send a message and respond to a message. But, there's definitely been some parameters put around that to say, okay, please don't send, messages through the middle of the night. Please don't send, expect something back on the weekend from somebody just because you sent them a message. So there's been a lot of awareness around devices and things like that, and especially when it's like you send out a message and not really thinking you're asking for a reply, but the person that gets it might think you really want it. So now they feel under pressure, and then since it's not a personal interaction, that there might be some you don't have the emotion there as to what the expectation is. So just got to control the kind of the work-life balance on the technology.
Jim brings up a great point, and I learned the painful lesson that way. I used to use Sunday nights to get caught up on email because I hated to have my email box full when I walked into work on Monday morning to start out kind of behind the 8 ball. So Sunday evening, I would bang out and clear out my email box. That was my goal, was to have it down to 0. And my team knew that. The people who worked for me, they knew that Sunday night they were going to get a flood of emails from me, and what was happening is they would start responding to me on Sunday night. So instead of clearing out my email box, at best it was cleared out for about an hour, or when I got up Monday morning they had all responded to me. So what I started to do is I cleared them out, but I stayed offline. I stayed offline until Monday morning. Monday morning they got flooded, but at least then I wasn't screwing up everybody's weekend and taking my bad work habits and making it their bad work habits. I mean, I was doing it for noble reasons, for my own sanity, but I realized I was creating a lot of churn within my organization, and I now had my whole team and possibly their teams working Sunday nights, which was never my intention. But thinking about what that implication is huge.
Yeah, I had a CEO who actually, all of his meetings, he had a little paper sign that said no cell phones, and he didn't want cell phones in the meeting. And then he retired, and a new CEO came in, and I think I got I was on an email every 10, 20 minutes. He lived on his cell phone. And I actually had to approach him and say, okay, what do you want from me? What kind of expectation do you have? And we ended up with an agreement of how he would, phrase it, or maybe just copy me or whatever it is, and how he wanted to reply. And I had to physically ask him, because I'd gone from my old CEO who barely used his cell phone to somebody who used it every 10 minutes. So you really have to establish, it sounds a little silly, but establish those parameters. And like you, Naren, I used to go offline Friday and Saturday, and I would answer emails occasionally, but I wouldn't send them until Sunday night or Monday. Because if you send and reply Friday, you're going to get one Saturday morning, and then you're going to reply, and then the whole weekend's gone. So.
Question for the whole panel, we're going to weigh in. Many of the students in the audience are master students. What are the pros and cons of staying on a technical track versus a management track? What would be some indicators when somebody should make the shift?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really depends what those longer-term career aspirations are. I mean, I wanted to run a business someday, so I kind of knew, even when I was an undergrad, I was getting that engineering foundation, but I knew I was going to go back and get my MBA. So for me, the ultimate goal was the opportunity to run a business. I didn't care if it was big business, small business, but I knew that I had to have the technical grounding because I wanted to do it in a technology business per se. So in my case, I kind of knew early on. My guess is, again, it's what do you want to be doing 3, 4, 5 jobs from now? And that will help you understand what are the experiences you should get here or in school, and then what are the experiences you should build up to that job.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. On a technical track, it just depends on if that company can sustain that, that type of track, on what they're doing, in different practices, or if the model is to progress into understanding the business, then progressing into managing people, and then eventually generating business and getting into the leadership into the business. So it really just depends on what you want, and then what the company can offer.
And I think you have to think about what you want to fill your day with. If you really enjoy just computations and really working the engineering of a problem, there's nothing wrong with just staying on that career track. But if you're a person where sometimes that might even get a little boring, or you really enjoy more of the social aspect, dealing with customers like Jim talked about, and getting more, people management, if you enjoy that, then maybe gravitate towards people management. Now, there's a lot in between. You can be purely people management and very little or no technical, or you can be fully technical, or you can find something in between. In my business, we need a lot of technical engineering managers. So as I was going up through the ranks, I had a lot of jobs where I was probably 50% technical and 50% people. And then I sorted out kind of what I wanted to do after that. But it's really what you enjoy doing, because you're going to be working a really long time. And I've seen a lot of engineers that have tried people management and just found they didn't like it. It wasn't that they weren't good at it or couldn't do it. They just didn't really like it. It's a great question.
You'll make a good student.
It's nice to be on this side once.
So what are kind of the big problems that you have in your industry? Because I feel like we talk about like manufacturing and things where it's physical products and like cutting costs, cutting scrap rate, worrying about your supply chain activity, and then just say like not really engineering, but more brand management and stuff. But I feel like I don't know really what your big problems are in the service industry.
Yep.
Can I make a suggestion? Go
Sure.
back to the slide where you list the manufacturers that are on the, one more, that one. So if you look at the right-hand side and some of the examples of the companies that provide services, it might make it easier to speculate on what kind of things are gonna drive out costs, increase value, and quality, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say in the retail industry, it's providing more services. And, so I would say, about 10 or 15 years ago, it was still, store focused. So it was like, okay, I have a big competitor that might be up here on this sheet here up in the upper left, who's really beating us up on price. So how am I going to differentiate ourselves versus them? And a lot of companies have gone towards offering services. So the first thing is, okay, what are those services that people want that are going to differentiate them? And then how am I going to pay to provide those services? So they look internally for those kind of cost takeout that they can, because if you think about store associates and maybe people working in the store, it's like their biggest controllable cost. So you're looking for ways to minimize how long it takes to process that shipment, get all that all that product on the floor. It takes a lot of labor to do it. So those are the things that they were looking at originally, and then they kind of evolved, and now we're talking about I want to buy online and pick it up. All that seamless omni-channel type things around operations. That's the big nugget right now. So that, and that, like the guest experience. So everything's around experience now. Is like, well, what am I going to do with my store now that I have all this online and omni-channel ways to buy things. So those are the things, and so it all comes down to the operations behind that to minimize that cost.
I'll give you a specific example from my own career. I worked for GE for a little over a decade. One of my jobs, I was running the medical system service business, so over in Asia. So the equipment manufacturing business sold CTs, MRs, X-rays, sold them to hospitals and clinics. And then the service business was there to provide maintenance services. So if you had a big MR, we would go in there and do the maintenance. When the MR broke down, we would get the call and we would go in there. So our biggest issue, our number one issue, was how do we shorten the elapsed time to repair, what we called ETTR. So from the time the equipment goes down to the time we got it back up and running was our goal, and our goal was to get that as close to zero as possible, because in that situation, the customer loved the equipment, but if it wasn't working, they weren't generating revenue. They weren't putting patients through that machine. So CT equipment, for example, had these large X-ray tubes, CT tubes. that over time would start to decay and ultimately the tube would fail. We worked with our customers and our engineering team to put monitors on that, to put a bunch of sensors on there, because every tube had a signature, and over time, as it got closer to failure, you would see that signature shift. So we created a monitoring center where we tied in all of those CTs, and we could call a customer and say, within the next X number of days, that tube is highly likely to fail. And we would convince the customer to don't wait till it fails, then call us, because then you're going to deal with downtime. Schedule some downtime. You may replace a tube that has some useful life in it, but you can do it on your terms. Do it on a Saturday, do it in the night when people aren't running images and like. So our whole focus was, how do we minimize elapsed time to repair?
In the aerospace company I worked for, we had about 1,600 engineers and 50 black belts. And those black belts were deployed all throughout the company. Everything from your standard manufacturing, how can we manufacture this faster? How can we get pieces and parts into the system, into inventory? And then we even had one deployed in our personnel department. How are all the interviews conducted? How can we more quickly or streamline the interviews and deal with all of the applicants that are coming through the door? In fact, I don't have the numbers with you, but when we looked at the end of the year of all the savings, value added, the most value came from our personnel department and how we streamlined their operations and made the whole experience of people coming into our company and leaving our company more efficient and more value added.
It's funny, I worked in both manufacturing businesses and service businesses, and even service organizations within manufacturing businesses. And I had more fun working in the service businesses than I did on the equipment business for a couple reasons. One is they're much shorter cycle. I worked for GE. The development cycle for the next MR was a 2 to 3 year development cycle often. We were working to shorten that, but decisions you made today, you wouldn't know for a couple years whether that was the right technology decision or the right product decision. In the service business, we were changing our service offerings dynamically. You make a decision, you roll out a new service, you get immediate feedback from the market. So very short cycle, it shortens the learning process. The margins in service businesses tend to be a lot better than they are in the equipment business, because the equipment business is very competitive. There weren't as many people competing on the service side, especially the big ones. The relationship with the customers, selling product to them was very transactional. So you'd interact with them once every couple years when they needed a new piece of equipment. On the service side, you were interacting with them on a day-to-day, and it was much more of a relationship sell, and it was much more about trust. Did they trust you? Did they trust your team? And the dynamics were just very different. I found it to be much more stimulating and exciting to work in those service businesses.
So commercial. So the center that I direct, the Center for E-Design, focused on that hard problem where it's a long period of time, and actually industrial and systems thinking people are really good at how can we improve that upfront process so that we can actually consider what all the consequences are going to be much later so that we can do it right the first time.
Yep, design for service and like
all sorts of things where the analytics and the visualization and including the customer early on so that we can have that conversation and that collaboration. I have a question on the slide that follows this one. That one. Okay, so nationally, we keep hearing this, and with the prior president and the current president, bring jobs back to America. Now, if I look at this, what we don't know, what's not showing here is how over time has the unemployment rate, if you will, how does that overlay with this? Because if we just listen to the manufacturing portion of it, I'm playing devil's advocate because even I want to understand this better. If it's really that the larger piece of the pie and logically more service oriented, is that just because of offshoring? Does that mean the same number of people are still employed? It's just that they're doing different jobs? And if that's the case, then why are we hearing that there's a problem, it's just that they're different.
I think it's the quality of the jobs. I mean, what's happened, at least in my experience, and during my time with GE and with Tyco, I probably contributed to it. You move manufacturing offshore because of low labor costs, and not just the labor costs of what you put in, but the labor costs that's embedded in your supply base also. So it's not just what you do, it's what your suppliers do, because when you move manufacturing, you also move your supply chain, so you end up creating either new suppliers locally in China and Vietnam, in Latin America, wherever you're doing it. But over time, what we found is the distance between the design engineers and the manufacturing floor created a problem. You wanted engineers, design engineers, who could spend more time on the shop floor. So again, to your point, design for manufacturability, design for service. So after we moved manufacturing, it made sense to move the engineering with it. So there's still a lot of service jobs, but many of the service jobs in there are inside the retail stores, inside the food industry. And those have to go where the customers are. You can't provide those. So I think the quality of the jobs have not been as good, and I think that's part of why you've seen wages not growing or even shrinking for a pretty long for the last decade or longer. One person's hypothesis in theory. So there are jobs. Quality of the jobs may not be what you want.
One of the things I'd like to do is tap into the panel's experiences and what along the way made them successful. But before I do that, does anybody have any other questions about job searchers or interviews or?
So mostly many of the students here are international students. So what do you look at as a recruiter and for an international student? Because you will have to sponsor them for whatever. So what do you look at them differently, or what is the aspect which you want from them that you don't expect from maybe
Sure.
Unfortunately, I can't speak to that because my company was aerospace and it was government controlled with clearances, so we were not allowed to hire international students.
Honestly, I don't look at any difference. I'm looking for the best qualified person. Yes, there may be some incremental cost of supporting the H-1B visa or the work permit, but to me, that's when I hire somebody, I'm hopefully hiring them for a career. That's a one-time cost that we kind of have to deal with, and you kind of navigate your way through that. Unless I was absolutely 100% indifferent between two candidates, it would never factor into my thinking. I'm looking for the best candidate, and honestly, you want a diverse workforce. I always wanted a workforce that looked like my customer base. And my customer base was always very diverse, because otherwise, if you don't have engineers or other employees, salespeople who can think like and understand what our customers are thinking, then you're not going to create those innovative solutions that better meet our customers' need than our competition. Now, you're right, there are industries like
unfortunately,
Sherry's
there's
that are
some.
very different, that there will be a lot more to overcome.
Yeah, I would just say, my company, it's, there's work across 126 different countries and 400,000 people, so that's where, the diversity globally comes into it, but the, definitely within the U.S. But I can't speak to it much either.
When you're hiring and you put something into a job ad that says like 3 to 5 years experience or 5 to 8 years experience, how important is that? And are you specifically looking for experience in like that specific thing, or just this person has worked in the industry and isn't straight out of college?
At least in the aerospace business, it depended on the job. If we were looking for an attitude control specialist, then yes, it would be somebody that had experience in that area. But if we were looking for a software engineer, electrical engineer, the breadth would open much more. And even if they didn't have as many years experience, we were very lenient on saying, well, they had years of graduate school, and that would count for, I forget what the ratio was for years of experience. So we were very lenient, but it did depend on exactly what the job was. If it's very narrow, it's going to be much harder, but if it's much broader, you'll have a much easier time.
Yeah, I always got uncomfortable when we were doing most of our hiring from industry and not building a pipeline. It is expensive to bring talent in from the outside. I mean, again, they're at a higher compensation level to begin with, and two is for me to hire them away from wherever they're working means most likely I have to pay them more. And I would much rather be able to develop a pipeline of talent internally. That's not to say, to Sherry's point, when we had gaps and holes that we needed to fill immediately, then I'd go recruit from industry. But I would, every company I worked for, I worked hard to make sure we had a good entry-level program so that we could develop talent, in the pipeline at all levels.
So how would you go about finding a job that is gonna create one of those pipelines? Like, how do you find that in a
Almost
company?
every job, I've been looking at jobs for the last few months, and almost every single job is at least 5 years experience. I see very little entry.
And I would apply for every
Yep,
one of them.
I would.
Let them say
Right.
no. You should never take yourself out of the running for a job unless you don't think you can do the job. If you think you can do the job, you should apply and put the onus on the employer or the hirer to say, no, you're not qualified.
So at a university like Penn State, likely, if you don't miss the cycle, it's probably very helpful to go to some of the job fairs, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's where, we've built our pipeline on our team, in many different schools through the intern co-op program, job fairs that are here in the spring and the fall.
So actually, I don't know what the participation has been of graduate students in these, but the student chapter of IISE, that's through the professional systems engineer, is having the same panel with them in the next hour. And what IISE does is they actually, along with when the university does their recruiting event or the college, they actually have one in the department as well. And so the question then is, I guess, I don't know how many companies are only, are they segregating that they're only looking for undergraduates at a certain time, or would they consider master's students during the same recruiting events? Would it be helpful to make these announcements when, to our graduate students as well? Or do we? Do you guys get announcements about, you do?
The job fairs.
Yes, no? You do,
Mhm.
okay.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting because depending what kind of company you're working for, you either have a real positive view of those job fairs or you have a real negative view. When I was with GE, I loved the job fairs because I knew when we had a booth in a job fair, we had the brand, everybody was coming to us. When I worked for Tyco, which was still a big company but didn't have the brand awareness, and actually because of some issues years ago had somewhat of a tarnished brand, I was less enthusiastic about going to the job fair because I wasn't going to be able to compete with the presence that GE had. I did more of this kind of stuff, and I spent more time with the professors, with the the deans, with the department heads, saying, who are your best people and how do I get to meet them? And we recruited outside of the normal process. So, like I said, there's the companies are all going to recruit different ways, and that kind of puts you in the position where you have to seek opportunities in a variety of different ways.
And don't be afraid, as Darren said, to apply for a lot of different things. I used to advise students to apply for the senior internships, even if they were in their master's program, because you get your foot in the door. Many companies often have, I know my company, we had a quota of 75 interns every summer, and we may not have had 75 job opportunities on the books at that time, but you got your foot in the door, you had a solid couple months, and there you are, and you can just continue. So don't be afraid. Maybe the first couple months is maybe a little lower start than what you expected, but it gets you in the door.
Yeah, I see more and more my last 2-3 years at ADT, I saw more and more graduates in our intern program. Now, the negative side is I don't think you get all the benefits and everything, but to Sherry's point, we hired a lot of those graduates if they wanted.
Yeah, we hired about 75% of our interns.
Yeah.
So.
So like if you get a job and then I feel like it's very hard to get promoted within. You say that people, you don't like to hire outside talent, but like I worked in industry for 2 years before I came back to grad school. And in that job, I was very unlikely to get a promotion because of the team I was on. But my fiance, who was working, at a different company, he got a promotion, but he's doing work 2 levels above what he is right now. I'm spilling my water there, but he's doing a job. He's doing the work of 2 levels above what he should be doing, and he's not getting paid for it. And they're like, oh, we can't bump you up a level even though you're doing the work. So do you see that in industries that you work in?
So again, there's 2 sides to that equation. I like building people through the pipeline because they are more cost effective. When I was in that pipeline, I was as frustrated as you are because they were going to pay somebody from outside to do a job that they knew I could do, and they were going to pay him or her more than they were going to pay me. So like I said, it is the dilemma that all businesses, what I would always bias myself to the internal person because I knew they were a cultural fit. Through their manager, you knew what their work ethic was. You know the bad, but you know the good, and not just because you spent an hour with them. I mean, learning enough about a person in an hour interview, it's a gamble. So my bias was always internal, with immediate and direct feedback on these are the areas that concern me that you've got to develop, so at least that person knew exactly what I was concerned about when we put them in the role. But like I said, every company is different, and I just say if you're in a company that's not going to reward you, not going to develop you, leave. Life's too short. And that's why you're back here, I guess. So.
Yeah.
What are the skills that managers or leaders in organizations basically need to manage their subordinates or get the most out of them?
I understood the question.
Qualities of leadership, I think, is what he's asking about.
Wow, that's the tough one. And it's one where some companies are really good at it and some companies are really bad. Some people will take really good engineers and make them managers, which is the biggest mistake you can do because they can be really good engineers if they have no people skills. I mean, what do I look for? It starts with what Jim said. It's really good communication skills, the ability to assess talent, and then to be able to have that candid feedback and coaching of talent. I mean, leading a team is very different than being an individual contributor, and a lot of those things you tend to be able to see on the job, but it's communication, it's the ability to judge talent, and it's coaching and mentoring versus doing.
Yeah, and it just depends on how the performance management program is set up within your company. And even if it is set up in a formal way, people will take advantage or not advantage of that as well. So like within our company, everybody has what's called a career counselor. So that's somebody you can talk to that's in a level or 2 above you that you can talk to on a regular basis around performance, and then they kind of give you your performance feedback as it comes in through the formal performance thing, but performance management program. But not everybody takes advantage of that. They may not talk to their career counselor, once or twice the whole year, or other people have monthly checkpoints where they're getting like that constant feedback, and they might not be their direct supervisor because you might be working on 2 different projects, but they'll give you advice on have you talked to your supervisor about this or this or this, and why don't we talk about that on our next call, and things like that. So it's just how you manage your own career.
But when I would evaluate managers as far as their ability to be promoted, I would actually review the performance appraisals that they wrote for their people to see, are they being candid? Are they giving specific development needs and working with them on action plans? If they're, to Jim's point, if they're just going through the performance review process and everybody in their organization meets expectations with no differentiation, that's not a manager I want. I want a manager who's going to differentiate their top talent from their underperformers, that's going to be very specific in their feedback. This is what I expect you to do to improve your performance, because again, I hire a manager to get the most out of the team, not because they're a great individual contributor.
So some of what I heard was owning your career, right? So even if you didn't enter a company that had a formal management training program, there's likely opportunities periodically where you could improve your skills and add to your own resume by taking short courses or other things that could add to your skill set, and letting it be known, I think, is communicating to whoever your manager is what it is that you would like to do, and then looking for their input and advice on how to get there, or things that you can take advantage of within the organization. If you're quiet and you don't communicate, then the chances are you're not very good mind readers, and that makes it even harder getting to where you want to be.
Well, and it's networking. I mean, you get to know all of the other departments and organizations around you, what they do, get to know the people, find leaders who you admire. I mean, I moved from engineering to marketing in GE, from technology to marketing in GE, because I got to know one of the big business leaders. You know, we were there, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and we used to just bounce ideas off of each other. And then when he got into a big P&L role, he hired me to be his marketing guy. I didn't have marketing experience, but because he knew that I had some of that critical thinking, I was a creative thinker, because we spent, hours, just talking to each other about, if we had this, if we could do this, here's what it would be. So you got to build that network so that when a job opens up, somebody is thinking about you, and not just.
So that was essentially your interview, all those informal conversations.
And one of the biggest ways to get noticed is look for holes in the company or problems in the company and go solve them. You may be asked to do it, you may not be asked to do it, but figure out what's an impediment in the company and go solve it. And believe me, you will be recognized. You'll get a title of Mr. and Mrs. Fix-It, and they'll say, well, hey, Bob fixed that last time, let's see if he can go do this. It sounds simple, but really you will get recognized in your achievements. And you may fail along the way. You may not be 100% successful, but the fact that you have that passion and that drive to dive in. How many people know, her last name is Megan Whitman. She took, and I wrote down the statistics because it's always amazed me, she took eBay from 30 employees to 15,000 employees in the late 90s, and from a sales of $4 million to $8 billion. And she wrote a book called Power of Many, which I would suggest that people might read. And her number one thing that she said was, dive in and don't be timid. Yeah. Dive in and solve the problems. And that's what she did her entire career. She took companies, and she ended up as a very, very successful CEO.
She's at HP now, leading
yeah,
one of
now
the
she's at HP.
businesses.
She did fail at being governor of California. I guess she was outvoted.
No, she didn't fail. She was lucky.
She was lucky,
not to be the governor of California.
Exactly.
She kind of got the job. That would have been a failure.
Yes, yeah, but you don't know. It's good to have a mentoring program. It's good to have leadership programs. But boy, if you're just on your own, go solve those problems, because that'll get you recognized in a big hurry.
Okay, any last questions? We're really right at the time. Yeah, Mariam?
How is the job market for PhDs compared to masters?
And industry, yeah.
I mean, again, my experience is only on the 2 companies that I sit on the boards of now, so I don't have as broad a base. But, again, in areas where there is deep technical depth required, I'm on the board of NextEra Energy, which is the parent company of Florida Power and Light, and they do renewable energy. When it comes to turbine blade design and wind turbine optimization, they're looking for the experts, because somebody who can get an extra 1/10 of a point of efficiency out of a wind turbine is worth gold to them, because that's what will allow them to win projects. So for PhD, it's the depth of expertise you have in the relevant areas. But I think you have to just be more targeted on, where you think that will apply and the companies that will value that.
So the other thing that I heard was about passion, and I think that relates to the answer to that question as well as the other questions too. When I first went to work for GE, I had a master's degree, and I worked for a company that had GE Drive Systems, it used to be called.
Salem, Virginia.
Salem,
Tom
Virginia.
Brock.
Tom Brock. Yes. He funded my PhD too, by the way. Although after I worked for GE, 82 to 84, before I came back. That was pre-Tom Brock. Can't remember his name. Anyway, if you go to a manufacturing facility and there's one or no PhDs in the whole place, it's likely that they're not going to be interested in PhDs. They're interested in people that do typical kind of IE things, and that is driving out cost and
Speed, cost, and quality.
Having efficiencies and maybe there is some product innovation there. There's looking at your supply chain, et cetera. But there are very specific locations that many companies have where a PhD is the only way you'll get a job there. Like if you went to corporate research and development or United Technologies or for General Electric or we can come up with many. If you did not have a PhD, you can forget it, right? So it depends on what your heart is in. If you're the one who likes that tinkering with, I want to contribute to the next thing, right? And that could be a methodology or a tool or whatever, if you want to be that pioneer, that then flows down to the other business units, then great. But you have to think about where your heart is.
I think Jim hit on one of the areas that I think is the hottest and one of the most important areas right now in the IE space, and that's customer experience. It's how do customers engage with your product, or how do they engage with your business, and that is huge because right now, customer loyalty, customer engagement, and is driving everything, and the mobile world especially.
Okay, so these probably need just a few minutes